What does the price of your monthly Spotify subscription have to do with a bombed-out power plant in the Middle East or, an unpaid TSA agent down in Atlanta?
Yeah, or even a brand new weight loss drug just sitting on the shelf at your local pharmacy.
Exactly. Normally, you'd think absolutely nothing, right?
Uh,
We tend to view the news as this series of totally isolated events, like
Hmm.
a hurricane hits a coast, you see the damage on TV.
And
Right.
unless you live in that exact town, you just change the channel.
Right. You change the channel and go about your day.
Well, we prefer to categorize information. I mean, it makes the world feel manageable. Geopolitics goes in one bucket, personal finance goes in another, and healthcare goes in a third.
But when you actually look at the stack of sources we're unpacking today, all coming from late March 2026, those buckets just completely disintegrate.
Oh, totally. They don't exist anymore.
We're not looking at isolated events. We're looking at this massive, invisible spiderweb of cause and effect. You pluck one single string in the Middle East, and the vibration travels so incredibly fast across the globe that it literally alters the price of the food sitting on your dinner plate.
And dictates the algorithm curating the music playing in your headphones.
It's wild.
It is the absolute definition of a macroeconomic butterfly effect. We're analyzing this deeply interconnected web of systemic shocks where, a political decision made at 7 a.m. Instantly rewrites the supply chain of some mundane household product by noon.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're going to connect the dots between global geopolitics, domestic policy gridlock, these unprecedented medical breakthroughs, and the artificial intelligence arms race.
Right.
We want to help you, the listener, understand the profound underlying mechanics that are actively rewriting your daily life and your financial future. But before we dive into this web, I really need to make a foundational directive for this show crystal clear.
Yeah, this is a crucial disclaimer given the nature of the material we're synthesizing today.
It is. So, our sources today contain highly politically charged content. We are going to be discussing actions taken by the Trump administration, the ongoing U.S.-Iran war, the Department of Homeland Security government shutdown, border and ICE policies, and, legislative actions by Democratic lawmakers like Senator Elizabeth Warren.
It's a heavy list.
Very heavy. And I want to state explicitly to you, the listener, that this deep dive takes absolutely no sides. We do not endorse any political viewpoints whatsoever. Our strict directive is to impartially report the facts exactly as they're presented in the source material.
We're here simply to help you understand the landscape.
Exactly. The landscape and the mechanics of what is happening. We are analyzing the engine. We are not arguing about who should be driving the car.
And that engine is currently redlining. I mean, if we want to understand how this spiderweb vibrates, we have to start at the source of the most immediate kinetic energy,
which is physical oil. Let's start with the Middle East. The U.S.-Iran war has now entered its fourth week, and the downstream effects are just staggering.
Yeah, the conflict has severely disrupted the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, and for some context for the listener, this is that narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. It is the ultimate global choke point.
It really is. Roughly 20% of the entire world's global oil supply passes through that specific strait.
20%.
Yeah, and the International Energy Agency, the IEA, is sounding a massive alarm right now. Fatih Birol, their executive director, reports that over 40 Middle East energy assets across 9 different countries have been severely damaged in the crossfire.
40 assets.
Oh.
I mean, to understand the gravity of that, we have to look at the historical precedent Birol is invoking.
Exactly. He equated the severity of this current conflict to the massive 1970s oil shocks and the 2022 European gas crisis combined.
Oh, combined.
Combined. Because the 70s shock fundamentally altered global economics, right? It created stagflation, high inflation, coupled with stagnant economic growth. And the 2022 crisis forced entire European nations to restructure their energy grids overnight.
Right.
Birol is suggesting we're facing both scenarios simultaneously because those 40 damaged assets, they represent physical infrastructure that cannot be quickly replaced. You can't just flip a switch to repair a bombed-out refinery or a pipeline.
Which brings us to the geopolitical pressure cooker that just exploded over the markets. So President Trump had issued this highly specific 48-hour ultimatum to Iran. Fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, or the U.S. military would obliterate Iranian power plants.
And the global markets were bracing for absolute impact.
Completely. Everyone was anticipating a massive escalation. But then, a sudden pivot. Trump ordered a 5-day pause on those strikes. He told CNBC's Joe Kernan that they had, productive conversations and that he is very intent on making a deal.
And The market reaction was violent and instantaneous. Brent crude, which is the major international benchmark price for oil, it plunged nearly 11%.
11% in a day?
Yep, dropping down to $99.94 a barrel purely on the news of that 5-day pause. And this massive swing occurred right after Asian markets had completely tumbled the night before.
Right, I saw that. The Kospi was down, what, 6.5%?
Yeah, Kospi down 6.5 and the Nikkei in Japan was down 3.5, both pricing in a catastrophic regional war.
Okay, but here is where the story shifts from a standard geopolitical headline to, like, a Wall Street thriller. It's not just the price swing that has everyone on edge. It's the highly suspicious timing of the trades that preceded the announcement.
Oh, the timing is wild. We really need to break down the timeline and the mechanics of the futures market to understand why this anomaly is setting off massive alarm bells.
Let's do it.
So, at exactly 6:50 a.m. in New York, there was a massive, highly isolated spike in trading volume on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the CME. Someone or some entity executed a massive order for S&P 500 E-mini futures and West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, oil futures.
Okay, let's pause and translate that. Because for the listener who doesn't spend their morning staring at Bloomberg terminals, what exactly is an S&P 500 E-mini future? And what does it mean to short WTI oil?
Right, good question. So a futures contract is essentially a financial agreement to buy or sell an asset at a predetermined price at a specified time in the future.
Okay.
The S&P 500 E-mini is a fraction of the value of the standard S&P 500 futures contract. It makes it highly liquid, very popular for betting on the overall direction of the U.S. stock market. Buying those means you're betting the stock market is about to go up.
Got it. And the oil.
Shorting WTI crude oil futures means you're borrowing contracts to sell them at the current high price, fully expecting the price of oil to drop so you can buy them back cheaper and pocket the difference. You are placing a massive bet that oil is going to crash.
And doing this at 6:50 in the morning is incredibly strange, isn't it? I mean, the regular stock market doesn't even open until 9:30 a.m. Eastern.
The timing is the smoking gun here. Early morning futures markets are notoriously thin when it comes to liquidity. There just aren't many buyers and sellers actively trading at that hour compared to, the midday rush.
Right.
Because the volume is so low, a massive, sudden burst of buying and selling sticks out visibly on the data tape. It's the financial equivalent of someone backing a dump truck full of cash into a quiet suburban bank at 4 in the morning.
That's a great analogy. And then exactly 15 minutes later at 7:05 a.m., President Trump posts his announcement on Truth Social about the 5-day pause and the productive talks.
Yep.
Risk assets instantly rallied. The S&P 500 futures soared over 2.5%, and oil completely tanked. So if we look at the mechanics, whoever bought those stock futures and shorted the oil futures at 6:50 a.m. stood to make an absolute fortune just 15 minutes later when that post went live.
They perfectly front-ran the biggest geopolitical news of the month.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
We know that modern Wall Street is dominated by supercomputers. We have these high-frequency trading algorithms that read the web instantly. They scan social media sentiment, they track corporate flight logs, monitor satellite imagery of oil tankers, you name it.
They do.
So is it actually possible that a machine just picked up on a leaked rumor on some obscure forum or detected a subtle shift in data and executed the trade? Like, does this definitively scream human insider trading? Or is it just a really fast algorithm doing its job?
Look, while algorithmic macro-driven strategies can absolutely generate rapid capital flows without a single public catalyst, the precision and isolation of this specific volume spike blurs the line considerably.
How so?
An algorithm scraping sentiment usually reacts to a steady buildup of chatter, right? It creates a wave of escalating volume. This was a sudden, isolated cliff face of volume. It suggests conviction.
Like they already knew the answer.
Exactly. The entity executing that trade wasn't guessing based on sentiment. The size of the bet implies they knew the outcome.
Like knowing the winning lottery numbers 15 minutes before the draw.
Precisely. And the Securities and Exchange Commission and the CME Group, they're staying quiet for now. But the underlying anxiety regarding the integrity of the information flow is just palpable among institutional traders.
And while those institutional traders are moving billions of dollars in milliseconds based on digital info, physical supply is what actually runs the world for the rest of us.
Yes.
That is how this geopolitical shockwave hits you, the listener, directly in the wallet. The sources paint a grim picture of the physical reality on the ground. In China, Just the mere perception of a long-term closure of the strait led to massive panic buying.
We saw lines stretching for miles at gas stations.
Yeah, the state planner warned of a major imminent price hike, pushing prices to about $4.50 a gallon over there.
And the physical constraints are just as severe in the United States. Energy Secretary Chris Wright told CNBC that they're scrambling to bring more diesel to the market. Diesel prices have surged an astonishing 40%, hitting $5.29 a gallon.
A lot of people might hear that and think, well, I drive a standard electric car or I take the subway to work. Diesel prices don't really affect me. But that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the supply chain, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Diesel is the literal lifeblood of the global economy. Every physical item you interact with relies on diesel.
Your groceries, your clothing.
The lumber for your home, your Amazon packages, they all move on a diesel-powered freight train or an 18-wheeler. A 40% spike in the cost of diesel is not just an inconvenience for truck drivers. It functions as a direct, unavoidable, systemic tax on literally every single item sitting on a store shelf.
Chevron CEO Mike Wirth explicitly warned that the futures market is currently trading on scant information and pure perception. He noted that the actual physical supply of oil is much tighter than those digital futures contracts suggest.
Because you can pause a military strike with a social media post, but you cannot rebuild a destroyed pipeline with a tweet. The physical inventory takes months, sometimes years, to recover.
And this massive, unavoidable surge in energy costs is a textbook catalyst for broad economic inflation. When the cost to move goods increases by 40%, companies do not simply absorb that loss. They pass it down to the consumer.
Always.
This dynamic is exactly what has the Federal Reserve terrified right now about a second wave of inflation taking root in the economy. Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee explicitly warned that he's highly worried about inflation in this fraught but intense climate.
Goolsbee specifically mentioned that the Fed is desperate to avoid a repeat of the teen transitory mistake of 2021.
Yeah, let's unpack that. For those who might not remember the nuances of that period, teen transitory was the prevailing narrative among central bankers that the inflation we saw coming out of the pandemic was just a temporary glitch caused by supply chain bottlenecks.
Right. They assumed it would naturally resolve itself without aggressive interest rate hikes.
And they were incredibly wrong. Inflation became deeply sticky, forcing them into a brutal cycle of rate hikes later on. Goolsbee is terrified of repeating that exact same delayed reaction.
Because the Fed monitors energy prices closely, but they often focus more heavily on core inflation, right, which strips out volatile food and energy sectors to see the underlying trend.
But you can't really strip out a diesel spike.
No, the problem is that a 40% diesel spike eventually bleeds into core inflation because it raises the baseline cost of everything else. And while the Fed is obsessing over oil prices, there's another completely separate inflationary force hitting the consumer's wallet simultaneously.
Which brings us to tariffs. If the cost of diesel is the tax on moving goods, tariffs are the tax on simply bringing them into the country.
According to new economic analyses from the Yale University Budget Lab and the Tax Foundation, the current tariff regime is expected to cost the average U.S. household between $570 and $600 in 2026.
We really need to break down the actual mechanics of a tariff because it is one of the most widely misunderstood economic concepts in public discourse. A lot of people hear the word tariff and assume it means a foreign country is writing a check to the U.S. Treasury.
That is a pervasive misconception. A tariff is fundamentally a domestic tax levied on an imported good.
Okay, so give us an example.
If a U.S. company wants to import a shipping container of electronics from China, the Chinese manufacturer does not pay the tariff. The U.S. importing company pays that tax directly to U.S. Customs and Border Protection when the container arrives at the port.
So the U.S. company suddenly has a massive new expense. And what do they do with that expense? They bake it into the retail price. So when you, the consumer, go to the store to buy that electronic device, the price is higher. You are the one actually paying the tariff.
The burden falls almost entirely on the end consumer. Furthermore, the macroeconomic data reveals a troubling disparity in how that $600 average cost is felt across different demographics. The economics of broad tariffs often operate mechanically as a regressive tax.
Let's define that. Because a progressive tax takes a larger percentage of income from high earners. A regressive tax takes a larger percentage from low earners.
Right. And the data modeled by the budget labs shows that households in the bottom 10% of earners are losing roughly 0.8% of their after-tax income to these tariffs, Meanwhile, the top 10% of earners are losing only 0.3% of their income.
Why such a massive gap?
It comes down to consumption patterns. Lower-income households spend a significantly larger fraction of their total income on physical goods.
Like clothing, basic electronics.
Household supplies, groceries. These are the exact items most heavily impacted by import tariffs. Higher-income households spend a much larger percentage of their wealth on services. Things like financial advising, domestic travel, and dining out, which are generally insulated from cross-border goods tariffs.
So the lower your income, the harder the tariff hits your baseline survival budget.
Exactly.
And one of the most glaring, concrete examples of this regressive impact in our sources is the skyrocketing price of menstrual products. The data from the consumer research firm Circana shows that the average price of tampons and pads has jumped nearly 40% since 2020.
Hitting an average of $7.43 per unit.
Which is insane.
Industry analysts are referring to this specific price spike as a triple whammy. The first factor is raw material inflation. The fundamental cost of the agricultural and chemical inputs has risen.
Right.
The second factor is the broader supply chain and energy costs we just discussed, particularly the diesel required to transport bulky paper and cotton goods.
And the third factor is the tariff regime itself.
Yes. The United States has levied massive tariffs on cotton imports from major trading partners like China, Canada, and Mexico. The data shows that the U.S. collected $115 million through tariffs specifically on menstrual products containing cotton in 2025.
That's up from just $42 million in 2020, right?
Exactly. Major consumer goods conglomerates like Procter & Gamble are facing an estimated $1 billion in total annual tariff costs across their portfolios, and they're systematically passing those costs down to the consumer at the pharmacy counter.
It's a maddening dynamic. It literally feels like a subscription service just to be a woman. You can't simply opt out of purchasing these products. They're a biological necessity.
You really can't.
But let me challenge the corporate narrative here for a second. If massive companies like Procter & Gamble are jacking up the prices this aggressively just to cover their tariff liabilities, why are consumers still paying a premium for the brand names? If the price of a name brand tampon goes up 40%, why hasn't there been a massive immediate defection to generic store brand alternatives that are cheaper?
Well, the psychology of brand loyalty in the personal care sector is incredibly sticky. It's far more so than in food or electronics. As Kimberly Clark's CEO pointed out in the sources, if someone finds a specific brand of feminine care that works for their body, they might remain fiercely loyal to that exact product for 40 years.
Wow, 40 years.
It's a highly intimate product, and consumers crave absolute reliability. Switching to a generic brand carries a perceived risk of discomfort or failure that many are just unwilling to take, even in the face of steep price hikes.
But every rubber band eventually snaps if you pull it hard enough. And the sources indicate that this brand loyalty is finally breaking under the sheer weight of economic pressure.
But the shift isn't just a pivot from name brands to generic brands.
No, it's a fundamental shift in the type of product being consumed. We're seeing a massive migration toward reusable products. Companies like Salt, which manufactures reusable period cups and specialized absorbent underwear, are seeing explosive growth.
And what's genuinely fascinating about this pivot is the underlying motivation. For the past decade, reusable products in this space were heavily marketed around the concept of environmental sustainability, right? Like reducing plastic waste in landfills.
Yeah, the eco-friendly angle.
But the CEO of Salt explicitly noted that for Generation Z and younger consumers, sustainability is increasingly taking a backseat to simple affordability. The math just becomes undeniable. A $30 reusable cup can easily last for up to 10 years if cared for properly. That single purchase can save a user up to $1,800 over a decade compared to continually buying disposable products at $7 a box.
That's a huge difference.
This is no longer an eco-conscious lifestyle choice. It is a raw economic survival tactic. We are witnessing consumers alter deeply ingrained personal biological habits purely because they're being priced out of single-use goods by a combination of macroeconomic inflation and geopolitical tariff policies.
It's a perfect example of how macro policy forces micro behavior.
Yeah.
And it's not just individual consumers altering their behavior to dodge these costs. Massive global corporations are physically ripping up their supply chains and moving their operations to adapt.
Like Toyota.
Exactly. Toyota just announced they're investing a staggering $1 billion to increase production capacity inside the United States, specifically upgrading plants in Kentucky and Indiana to build the new Camrys and RV4s.
This is a massive capital expenditure designed as a direct strategic response to the friction of cross-border trade. I mean, if the cost of importing raw parts, microchips, or fully assembled vehicles from Asia or Mexico becomes too punitive due to unpredictable tariff regimes, the only logical long-term business move is to physically build the product inside the borders where it will eventually be sold.
So Toyota is essentially spending $1 billion upfront to bypass future tax liabilities and secure their domestic supply lines against political volatility.
Precisely.
So on one hand, you have the broader economic engine stuttering under the weight of inflation and defensive tariff maneuvering. But as companies try to localize their supply chains to avoid international friction, they are running headfirst into a massive domestic problem. The physical infrastructure moving us and our goods around the country is literally cracking under pressure.
The domestic logistics network is facing severe systemic gridlock, and it's most visibly playing out at our major airports. We are currently navigating a partial government shutdown centered entirely over Department of Homeland Security funding.
The mechanics of this shutdown are devastating for the workers involved. This political impasse between Democrats and Republicans over border security and immigration enforcement has essentially frozen the DHS budget.
Yeah.
As a result, Transportation Security Administration TSA agents are being forced to work without their regular paychecks. And the human response is entirely predictable.
When critical infrastructure workers are asked to perform high-stress jobs without financial compensation, the system breaks down.
Right.
We're seeing massive, coordinated sick-outs across the country, leading to hours-long security lines at major international hubs like JFK in New York and Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta.
The situation deteriorated so rapidly that the White House had to take unprecedented action. They actually deployed ICE's agents, Immigration and Customs Enforcement personnel, directly to the commercial airports just to help manage the overwhelming crowds.
And physically guard the exit doors so the remaining TSA screeners could focus entirely on processing the security lines. The Department of Homeland Security directly blamed the political shutdown for the crisis. They officially stated that over 400 TSA officers have outright quit in the past few weeks because they simply cannot afford to buy gas to commute or pay their rent without their guaranteed paychecks.
This isn't just an inconvenience that makes you miss your flight. It's a catastrophic drain on human capital. And that strain in the aviation sector is not limited to the security checkpoints inside the terminal. Out on the tarmac, the consequences of a stress system are proving fatal.
Yeah, this was incredibly tragic.
Amidst all this administrative chaos, there was a horrific collision at LaGuardia Airport in New York. An Air Canada regional jet carrying over 70 passengers collided with a Port Authority fire truck directly on the runway late Sunday night, resulting in the tragic deaths of both the pilot and the co-pilot.
The details surrounding the crash highlight a deeply concerning vulnerability in our aviation infrastructure. The audio from the air traffic controller managing the runway that night is chilling to listen to. He can be heard frantically trying to stop the fire truck from crossing the active runway.
Yeah.
Then, roughly 20 minutes after the collision, you hear him key the microphone and admit, "We were dealing with an emergency earlier. I messed up."
Let's dive into the mechanics of how a mistake like that happens at one of the busiest airports in the world. How does an air traffic controller lose track of a massive fire truck and a commercial jet?
Well, it requires a synthesis of several systemic failures. The Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, has been battling a chronic, severe shortage of fully certified air traffic controllers for years. The workforce is stretched incredibly thin. They're relying heavily on mandatory overtime to keep the towers staffed.
Right.
Now, while LaGuardia is a premier airport and doesn't usually suffer from the severe perennial understaffing seen at smaller regional hubs, the data shows it was lightly staffed during that specific overnight shift.
But wait, don't we have technology specifically designed to prevent human error from causing a collision? I thought airports had radar for the ground. Is airport surveillance technology actually making us safer, or is it just giving us a loud alarm while the disaster happens anyway?
They do have it. LaGuardia is equipped with an advanced surface surveillance system. It's a highly sophisticated technological safety net designed to track the precise movement of every vehicle and aircraft on the tarmac. When two vehicles are on a collision course, the system generates a loud, visual, and auditory alarm inside the tower.
Okay.
It is highly probable that an alarm was actively sounding in the background during the moments leading up to the crash.
This makes me think of a Jenga tower. or actually a computer's RAM, random access memory. You can have the most advanced security software running on your computer throwing up pop-up alerts about a virus.
Yeah.
But if you have 300 browser tabs open and the computer's RAM is completely maxed out, the system is going to freeze and crash regardless of what the software is trying to tell you.
That's exactly it.
The air traffic controller is the human RAM of the airport. If their cognitive bandwidth is maxed out from chronic exhaustion, understaffing, and the stress of managing a prior emergency on the airfield, it doesn't matter how loud the surveillance alarm rings. The human operating system has already crashed. We keep pulling out the bottom blocks of this Jenga tower unpaid TSA agents, fatigued controllers,
Yeah.
and expecting the tower to stand.
That analogy perfectly isolates the crucial vulnerability in human-machine interaction. Technology is exceptional at sensing a breach in safety protocols and generating an alert, but the entire system fundamentally relies on the human operator having the available cognitive bandwidth to process that alert, formulate a plan, and execute a response in seconds.
Right.
If the human bandwidth is depleted due to systemic fatigue, the technology is effectively neutralized. The system requires both the sensor to be accurate and the responder to be capable. Right now, across multiple facets of our infrastructure, the response capability is deeply compromised by political gridlock and underfunding.
And the political undercurrents of this frustration are fascinating because you can't separate the failing infrastructure from the political maneuvering happening in response to it. Our sources highlight how this national gridlock is bleeding down into incredibly localized political races.
Like the situation in Florida.
Yes. Take the situation in Florida. We have a Democrat named Emily Gregory running for a state house seat. What makes this significant is that she is running in the specific district that encompasses Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. She's a first-time candidate, and her entire strategy is built on avoiding national culture war debates.
Which is an interesting pivot.
It really is. Instead, she's hoping to capitalize on a recent trend of Democrats overperforming in special elections by hyper-focusing on localized kitchen table issues, specifically the skyrocketing cost of property insurance and crumbling local infrastructure.
And we see a similar dynamic playing out on the West Coast, where national grievances intersect with local governance. In California, Democratic gubernatorial candidate Eric Swalwell recently dropped a high-profile lawsuit against Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Bill Pulte.
The background on this is intense. Swalwell had formally alleged that Pulte was weaponizing federal mortgage fraud investigations to specifically target Swalwell and his associates as retaliation for Swalwell's vocal criticism of the Trump administration.
But dropping the suit is a calculated maneuver. Swalwell's campaign essentially framed the decision by stating they had successfully called Pulte's bluff, bringing enough public scrutiny to the agency to deter any further alleged retaliation. This allows them to redirect their legal resources back to the gubernatorial campaign. Regardless of the legal merits, it highlights how intensely national political friction, whether it's DHS funding, FAA staffing, or federal housing investigations, dominates the bandwidth of state-level politicians. They're desperately trying to navigate an electorate that is incredibly frustrated by rising costs and systems that feel fundamentally broken.
Before we move on from the topic of travel and failing systems, the sources actually provided a fascinating answer to a relatively mundane travel question that has baffled me for years. It's a perfect palate cleanser before we get into the heavy medical data.
Like boarding zones.
Yes. Why is it that when you buy a plane ticket and pay an extra $50 specifically to select your seat in the main cabin, you still end up boarding the plane in the very last group?
The Points Pro column in our sources breaks down the exact mechanics of airline loyalty economics. It is a brilliant piece of corporate conditioning. Paying a fee for seat selection is a completely separate transaction from priority boarding. The airline is selling you the location, not the timing. Unless you hold elite frequent flyer status, are flying in first class, or require special physical assistance, the fastest and most reliable way to jump the boarding queue is entirely tied to your participation in the airline's financial ecosystem.
You have to hold the credit card.
Precisely. If you hold a co-branded credit card, like the Delta SkyMiles Gold American Express or the United Explorer card, the airline automatically bumps your boarding priority. The airlines intentionally reserve the highly coveted convenience of overhead bin space as a reward for consumers who integrate the airline's financial products into their daily spending habits.
It's a hidden tier of access that generates billions in revenue from credit card swipe fees.
Entirely about monetizing access.
So we're watching our external physical systems, our international supply chains, and our domestic transportation hubs fail or fundamentally restructure under immense macroeconomic pressure.
Mm.
But if we zoom in and look inside the human body, we're witnessing an unprecedented wave of biological breakthroughs that are forcing entire global industries into a state of absolute panic.
We need to talk about GLP-1s.
We do.
The adoption rate of GLP-1 receptor agonist medications drugs, primarily known by brand names like Ozempic, Zepbound, and Wegovy, has reached a staggering critical mass. According to a recent KFF health tracking poll cited in the sources, roughly 1 in 8 adults in the United States are now currently taking a GLP-1 drug for weight loss or diabetes management.
1 in 8 adults. That's not a niche medical treatment anymore. That is a fundamental demographic shift.
Huge shift.
And the downstream economic effects of chemically altering the appetite of 1/8 of the adult population are monumental. The data shows that users on these medications are consuming, on average, 21% fewer calories per day. Consequently, they are slashing their household grocery bills by nearly a third.
This represents an existential crisis for the traditional food and beverage industry. J.P. Morgan released an estimate projecting that the widespread adoption of GLP-1s could wipe out up to $55 billion in annual sales for the food industry by the year 2030.
Wow.
The snacking segment, companies that rely on high-frequency, impulsive consumption of calorie-dense foods, is taking the most severe hit.
$55 billion in demand just vanishing because people physically do not want to eat the food anymore. So how are these massive corporate conglomerates reacting? They can't lobby to ban the drugs. The public demand is too high. So they're pivoting, and they're pivoting hard.
The corporate strategy is rapid adaptation through portion control and nutritional re-engineering. We are seeing massive acquisitions and product launches designed to capture the changing dietary needs of the GLP-1 user.
Give me some examples.
Well, for instance, the French food giant Danone recently purchased the UK-based protein shake manufacturer Huel for $1.15 billion. Nestle, a behemoth in the packaged food space, has launched an entirely new frozen food brand called Vital Pursuit, which is explicitly formulated and marketed to target GLP-1 users.
And it gets even more granular than that. J&J Snack Foods, the company responsible for stadium staples like Dippin' Dots, Icy E-Drinks, and Super Pretzel soft pretzels, is actively re-engineering their core products. They're intentionally shrinking the portion sizes of their churros and pretzels while simultaneously trying to infuse the dough with extra protein.
We really need to look at the mechanics of why protein is so critical to this specific demographic. When a patient rapidly loses weight on a GLP-1 drug, a significant portion of that weight loss can come from muscle mass rather than just fat if they do not consume enough protein.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, because the drugs work by slowing down gastric emptying, keeping food in the stomach longer to simulate fullness, users require higher fiber intake to maintain basic gut health and digestion.
You know, it reminds me so much of the low-carb Atkins diet craze of the early 2000s. Suddenly, every product in the grocery store had a brightly colored net carb label slapped on the box, even if it was just a loaf of highly processed bread.
Yeah, totally.
But this time feels profoundly different because the diet isn't based on willpower. It is chemically enforced by a pharmaceutical injection. But I have to push back on the corporate narrative here.
Go for it.
Are companies like J&J Snack Foods and Nestle actually making us healthier with these new product lines? Or is this just an incredibly clever form of shrinkflation? Like, are they just charging us the exact same amount of money for a much smaller, highly processed pretzel just because they sprinkle some whey protein into the mix and labeled it GLP-1 friendly?
It is heavily weighted toward margin protection rather than pure public health altruism. If we look at the profit and loss mechanics of a snack company, their entire model is built on volume. If a massive segment of their consumer base is suddenly going to eat 20% less volume, the company still has fixed costs, factories, distribution networks, payroll that they must cover.
Right.
To survive, they have to extract the exact same amount of profit from a physically smaller footprint of food.
So they shrink the pretzel.
They shrink the product, elevate the nutritional profile slightly to justify the change, and market it at a premium price point to a demographic that is hyper-focused on protein intake. It is a brilliant, albeit deeply cynical, financial mechanism to maintain corporate revenue in the face of chemically induced demand destruction.
It is biological demand destruction. And the high-stakes gambles happening in the medical space right now aren't just limited to the economics of weight loss. Look at the incredibly risky maneuver Pfizer is currently pulling with the FDA regarding their Lyme disease vaccine.
Oh, this situation is a fascinating case study in regulatory risk and the desperation of the pharmaceutical market. Pfizer, along with its European partner Valneva, is actively seeking full Food and Drug Administration approval for a human Lyme disease vaccine candidate.
Okay, so what's the catch?
What makes this extraordinary is that they are seeking this approval despite the fact that the vaccine officially missed its primary statistical goal in a late-stage phase 3 clinical trial.
Let's break down the mechanics of a clinical trial for the listener. How does a pharmaceutical giant fail the final, most important phase of a trial, but still possess the audacity to ask the FDA to approve the drug anyway?
Right. So in a phase 3 vaccine trial, the primary endpoint is usually a specific statistical threshold of efficacy. You need a certain number of people in the placebo group to contract the disease and a significantly lower number in the vaccinated group to contract it to prove mathematically beyond a reasonable doubt that the vaccine works. Pfizer argues that their trial missed this primary endpoint simply because the overall rate of Lyme disease infection in the general population during the study period was unusually low. Not enough people in the placebo group got bitten by infected ticks to provide the unassailable statistical confidence the trial protocol required.
But they still have data showing it did something.
Yes. Pfizer points to secondary data within the trial showing that the vaccine reduced the rate of infection by more than 70% in those who received it compared to the placebo group. They are essentially gambling that this strong underlying signal of efficacy will be enough to convince regulators to overlook the strict failure of the primary statistical endpoint.
But taking a gamble like that in today's climate seems incredibly dangerous. We live in an era where institutional trust in the FDA and the CDC is fragile, and vaccine skepticism is at an all-time high.
Very true.
Let me argue the other side of this. If the FDA approves a vaccine that officially failed its trial simply because people are desperate for a cure, aren't they just handing massive amounts of ammunition to the anti-vax movement? If this vaccine rolls out and has unexpected side effects or fails to protect people, you don't just lose the Lyme disease market, you potentially destroy whatever lingering trust the public has in the FDA's regulatory rigor entirely.
That is the exact tightrope the FDA is walking. However, to understand why Pfizer believes the FDA might take that risk, we have to look at the historical context of Lyme disease.
Yeah, because there isn't one right now.
Exactly. There currently is no human vaccine available for Lyme disease, despite the fact that roughly 500,000 Americans are treated for it annually, many suffering debilitating long-term neurological and joint issues. The market has been entirely barren for decades.
Because of what happened in the late 90s.
Yes. Back in 1998, a company called SmithKline Beecham, now part of GSK, introduced a Lyme vaccine called Lymerix. It was approved by the FDA and was roughly 80% effective. However, shortly after its release, a wave of highly publicized anecdotal reports emerged claiming the vaccine caused severe arthritis.
Even though there was no proof.
Right. Despite multiple subsequent studies and an FDA panel finding no scientific link between the vaccine and the arthritis, the media frenzy fueled class action lawsuits. The public panic totally tanked consumer demand, and the manufacturer voluntarily pulled it from the market in 2002.
Wow.
Since then, pharmaceutical companies have viewed a Lyme vaccine as legally radioactive. Pfizer knows that the public, especially those living in heavily wooded areas in the northeast United States, is increasingly desperate for protection as tick populations explode due to warming climates. Pfizer is betting that the FDA will weigh the sheer, undeniable public health necessity against the flawed trial mechanics.
It is a profound illustration of the gap between what modern science is capable of achieving and the massive regulatory, financial, and societal hurdles required to actually get that science into the bloodstream of the people who need it.
And that specific gap ties perfectly into a new initiative launched by our own network. CNBC Cures was recently unveiled, spearheaded by anchor Becky Quick, specifically to highlight the plight of the 30 million Americans currently living with rare diseases.
The initiative is comprehensive. It includes a dedicated newsletter, a serialized podcast called The Path, and a primetime documentary series. The core focus is on patients who are caught in the void between groundbreaking scientific innovation and the persistent lack of funding.
The mechanics of funding are the real bottleneck here. When a disease is classified as rare, meaning it affects fewer than 200,000 people in the U.S., the financial incentive for a massive pharmaceutical company to spend billions of dollars developing a cure is vastly diminished compared to developing a daily weight loss drug for 40 million adults.
The math simply doesn't yield a profitable return on investment. The CNBC Cures initiative aims to use heavy media visibility to force systemic changes in regulatory reform, encouraging investment and smoothing the pathway for these orphan drugs to reach the market.
So we have medical advancements fundamentally shifting billions of dollars and actively changing how we can live longer, potentially healthier lives. But that biological success raises a massive, looming societal question. How do we actually afford to fund that longer life?
Which brings us to the new playbook for wealth building in America. We're seeing a fundamental rethinking of how wealth is generated, distributed, and protected. And this conversation is starting at the very top echelons of Wall Street.
It is.
In his widely read annual chairman's letter, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink highlighted a new legislative initiative that is gaining massive traction, what are colloquially being called Trump accounts, or officially 530A accounts.
The mechanics of these 530A accounts are designed to function as an aggressive wealth generation tool from birth. Here is how they work. The Department of the Treasury provides a one-time $1,000 seed deposit for children born between the years 2025 and 2028.
Just giving them a grand right off the bat.
Exactly. This creates a baseline investment. From there, parents, guardians, or even corporate employers like BlackRock can contribute up to $5,000 annually in after-tax dollars into the account. The funds grow tax-deferred, similar to a Roth IRA or a 529 education plan.
Which is huge over 18 years.
Fink praised this structure as a significant structural step toward allowing young Americans to participate in and grow wealth alongside the broader U.S. economy, rather than just relying on wages.
But Fink didn't stop at praising children's accounts. He used his letter to drop a rather substantial intellectual bombshell regarding the third rail of American politics, Social Security.
Fink pointed out a glaring disparity in how the nation's ultimate safety net is managed. Currently, the combined Social Security, retirement, and disability trust funds are legally required to be invested exclusively in special issue U.S. Treasury bonds.
Which are safe by...
Right. In 2025, those bonds yielded an effective interest rate of roughly 2.6%. By stark contrast, the S&P 500, the broader stock market, gained roughly 16% over the same period. Fink argued that while Social Security provides absolute stability, the mathematical reality of a 2.6% yield means it fundamentally fails to allow Americans to actually build wealth or keep pace with real inflation.
Because of that massive yield gap, the math is starting to break down. We have a demographic dependency ratio problem. We have fewer young workers paying into the system to support a massive growing population of retiring baby boomers who are living longer than ever. That is why the trust fund is projected to hit a massive shortfall by 2032, triggering automatic benefit cuts if nothing changes. Fink is essentially suggesting that a portion of the Social Security system should be allowed to be invested in the stock market to chase those higher returns and close the gap.
He frames it not as privatization, but as necessary diversification, akin to how the federal government already manages the thrift savings plans for its own civil servants and military personnel.
Okay, I have to step in and aggressively challenge this premise. I completely understand the underlying math. Over a 30-year horizon, the historical data is clear. A diversified index fund tracking the stock market will undeniably beat a 2.6% Treasury bond. But investing the absolute bedrock safety net of American retirees into the volatile equities market feels like taking the family emergency fund to a casino in Las Vegas. Yes, the actuarial odds might favor you over 3 decades, but what happens to the senior citizen who retires and needs their immediate monthly payout during a severe 2008-style market crash? Does their monthly check get slashed by 30% because tech stocks took a dive that quarter? The volatility risk is entirely passed on to the most vulnerable demographic.
Your concern is precisely the core counter-argument raised by critics in Washington. Representative John Larson, for instance, vehemently pushed back on Fink's suggestion. Larson noted the historical resilience of the current system. Social Security has never missed a single payment, ever.
Right.
It remained steadfast during the dot-com bust, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic periods that completely devastated the balances of private 401k accounts.
The fundamental tension here is an immutable law of finance. Higher yields require higher risk. And injecting systemic market risk into a foundational poverty prevention program that currently keeps 29 million Americans afloat is politically and economically explosive.
It is a profound debate over how we define value, compensation, and the mechanics of wealth generation. And fascinatingly, this exact same debate regarding how workers capture the value they create isn't just happening in Washington or on Wall Street. It is actively playing out in professional sports.
WNBA.
Exactly. Look at the recent developments with the Women's National Basketball Association. The WNBPA just ratified a historic, transformational, new collective bargaining agreement.
The numbers on this new CBA are staggering. Under the new deal, the average WNBA player salary will increase to $583,000 by 2026. The maximum player salary could reach a jaw-dropping $2.4 million by the end of the deal in 2032. For context on how massive a leap this is, the average WNBA salary previously was hovering around $120,000.
One WNBPA president and player, Nika Ogumaike, was asked by the press to summarize the biggest win of this prolonged negotiation. She didn't give a long speech about respect or legacy. She just said 2 words: bank accounts.
I love that. The underlying mechanic of their victory is the exact concept Larry Fink was discussing. The players didn't just ask for a fixed raise. They fought to fundamentally restructure the economic model of the league.
Right. They demanded a revenue-sharing model that ties their salary structure directly to the macro growth of the league's television deals, merchandise sales, and ticket revenue. They demanded equity in the growth, rather than just a fixed wage.
Because of this massive restructuring, the lifestyle of the athletes will fundamentally change. Historically, because WNBA salaries were so low, top-tier players were forced to endure the grueling physical grind of playing overseas in European or Asian leagues during the WNBA offseason just to piece together a living wage.
That secondary market participation led to severe physical burnout and injuries. Now, with a base salary that reflects their actual economic value to the league, they can treat the WNBA as a true, single, full-time profession.
It is a perfect microcosm of wealth generation. Whether we are analyzing a 530A account for a newborn, debating the yield gap of the Social Security Trust Fund, or cheering for a new CBA for a professional athlete, the underlying principle is entirely the same. True wealth is generated by tying individual compensation directly to the macro growth of the underlying asset, rather than accepting a flat, safe, but ultimately stagnant fixed yield.
We are desperately trying to figure out how to fund our physical and financial futures, but attempting to project the economy forward to 2032 is incredibly difficult when the underlying technological foundation of the global economy, artificial intelligence, is shifting beneath our feet overnight.
Yeah, we have entered a new era where AI is being simultaneously weaponized by the military and aggressively monetized by consumer entertainment apps. Welcome to the AI arms race.
Let's start with the most high-stakes arena, the military theater. Senator Elizabeth Warren is currently demanding answers from the Department of Defense. Specifically, she is targeting Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth after the DoD made the drastic decision to officially blacklist the prominent AI startup Anthropic, legally labeling them a supply chain risk.
To understand why a software company is being treated like a rogue state actor, we have to look at the context of the ongoing U.S.-Iran conflict. Before the war escalated to its current level, the Department of Defense wanted unfettered contractual access to Anthropic's flagship large language model, known as Claude, to use for all broadly defined lawful purposes within military operations.
But Anthropic pushed back.
They refused to grant blanket access. Their corporate ethos is heavily focused on AI safety and alignment. They demanded ironclad, legally binding contractual assurances from the Pentagon that their AI model would absolutely not be used to power fully autonomous lethal weapons drones that decide to kill without a human pulling the trigger, or to facilitate domestic mass surveillance programs.
And when Anthropic refused to cave to the DoD's broad terms, the Pentagon retaliated by blacklisting them, completely cutting them off from lucrative federal contracts.
Senator Warren is calling this blacklist a blatant act of retaliation. She argues it is a heavy-handed attempt by the Pentagon to strong-arm American tech companies into building lethal autonomous weapons without any ethical guardrails or civilian oversight.
But the terrifying reality of the free market is that nature abhors a vacuum. The absolute second Anthropic was sidelined by the DoD for having ethical boundaries. Their biggest rival, OpenAI, immediately stepped into the void.
OpenAI swiftly signed a contract with the Department of Defense, officially allowing their technology to be utilized in the ongoing Iran conflict. OpenAI's public relations team claims they have a proprietary safety stack and specific contract language designed to prevent their models from being used for mass surveillance or direct lethal autonomous action.
However, the exact specifics of that contract remain heavily guarded and classified. This lack of transparency prompted Senator Warren to send a demanding, highly critical letter directly to OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, demanding answers on how exactly the military is deploying their code.
It's a profound battle for the digital high ground. And while the politicians argue over the software, the corporate sector is quietly fighting a brutal war over the physical hardware required to run these models. You cannot have an AI arms race without the silicon chips to power the algorithms.
That brings us to Elliott Management. Elliott is a massive, highly aggressive activist investor firm, and they just built a multi-billion-dollar stake in a company called Synopsys.
Synopsys is an $80 billion behemoth that operates largely behind the scenes. They specialize in something called electronic design automation, or EDA. Let's explain what EDA actually is, because it is the ultimate bottleneck of the entire AI industry.
Well, designing the physical microchips that power AI, like the highly coveted NVIDIA GPUs, is no longer a task that human engineers can accomplish manually. These chips contain billions of microscopic transistors. The architecture is so incomprehensibly complex that human brains cannot map the circuits.
Right.
You need highly advanced software artificial intelligence to design the chips that will eventually run the artificial intelligence. Synopsys builds that critical EDA software. Even NVIDIA, the undisputed king of the AI hardware boom, recently purchased $2 billion of Synopsys stock. Elliott Management recognizes a fundamental truth. Whoever controls the software that designs the chips controls the absolute baseline bottleneck of the entire global AI industry.
So we have the Pentagon fighting over how AI is used on the battlefield and hedge funds fighting over the chips to power it. But how does this technology impact the listener on a daily basis? This brings us from the military battlefield directly into the consumer's pocket.
Yeah, while the DoD fights over AI for national security, Spotify is aggressively integrating AI for pure corporate survival.
Spotify has rolled out a deep integration of ChatGPT technology, culminating in a new feature they are calling prompted playlists. The mechanics are fascinating. Users can open the app and literally type a highly specific mood, a vague memory, or hyper-niche criteria into an AI text box.
Like upbeat synth pop from 1986 that sounds like a rainy Tuesday in London.
Exactly. The AI instantly understands the semantic intent and generates a custom, perfectly curated playlist in seconds. Spotify claims their AI DJ feature now has roughly 90 million active users who have logged over 4 billion hours of listening time.
That's a lot of hours.
It is. But why the massive, expensive push into generative AI? Why is Spotify allowing users to essentially write their own algorithm?
It's a desperate attempt to build a defensive moat around their business. If you listen to Wall Street media analysts, they'll tell you that the core product of music streaming, the actual catalog of songs, has become entirely commoditized. Apple Music, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, and Spotify all essentially offer access to the exact same database of millions of songs.
All right, there's no real difference in what you can listen to.
If the underlying product is completely identical across all platforms, price competition eventually drives margins to zero. The only way Spotify survives and retains its subscriber base is by making the interface of their app so deeply personalized and so inherently sticky that the switching costs for the user become psychologically too high.
So if Spotify's AI knows exactly what obscure death metal track you need to hear to hit a personal record at the gym and seamlessly transitions into the exact lo-fi jazz you need to focus at work, you are never going to cancel your subscription to go to Apple Music and start training a new algorithm from scratch.
Exactly. It is entirely about locking the user into a behavioral loop.
It also highlights the surreal duality of the technology we're discussing. I mean, it's wild that the exact same foundational architecture or large language models is being fought over by the Pentagon to manage a kinetic war in the Middle East and being optimized by Spotify to ensure you don't skip a song on your commute.
It really is two completely different worlds.
But let me push you on the cultural implication of this AI curation, specifically regarding music. If we look at the data from our sources, AI text-to-music platforms are already capable of generating up to 7 million entirely synthetic, artificially created songs every single day.
It's unbelievable.
If the internet is flooded with synthetic music and Spotify's AI is constantly feeding us a perfectly curated, frictionless loop of the exact sonic patterns we already know we like, doesn't that completely kill the fundamental human joy of musical discovery? What happens to actual human artists when the algorithm fully takes over and prioritizes synthetic mood music over human expression?
That is the ultimate existential threat facing the creative class right now. The technological shift we're seeing is moving the listener from active discovery to passive consumption. If the AI perfectly anticipates your sonic needs, the friction of searching for new art disappears. You stop digging through record crates. You just open your mouth and consume the algorithmic feed. However, while AI can optimize delivery and synthesize patterns, the data shows that human fandom remains a highly unpredictable, deeply emotional variable that algorithms cannot fully control or replicate yet.
And the ultimate proof of that unpredictability is what just happened with BTS. The sources highlight a massive financial stumble for HYBE, the powerful parent company of the K-pop giants BTS. HYBE saw their shares absolutely tank, dropping 15% in a single day after the band's highly anticipated comeback concert in Seoul completely underperformed.
The corporate algorithms and ticket models projected a massive crowd of 260,000 fans. But when the doors opened, only about 100,000 people actually showed up.
The underlying dynamic there is the fickleness of human passion. During the extended period when the members of BTS were serving their mandatory military hiatus in South Korea, the cultural zeitgeist simply moved on.
The industry didn't pause. New K-pop groups debuted, new sounds emerged, and younger fans diverted their emotional and financial capital to new artists.
It proves that no matter how big the corporate machine behind you is, and no matter how advanced the predictive algorithms are, human passion cannot be purely modeled on a spreadsheet. You cannot force a teenager to love a band through sheer marketing force if the cultural moment has passed.
It serves as a vital reminder that while technology can optimize the delivery of art and manufacture the product, it fundamentally cannot manufacture authentic human connection or perfectly predict the shifting tides of culture.
I think that is the perfect note to start pulling all of these incredibly diverse threads together and wrap up everything we've unpacked today. We promised at the top of the show that we were going to connect the dots of this massive spider web.
And the picture those dots ultimately form is both complex and deeply revealing about the state of our systems.
To you, the listener, what this deep dive reveals is a world where massive, abstract macroeconomic forces are coming directly for your micro daily decisions. A geopolitical standoff and kinetic war in the Middle East is not just a headline to scroll past. It's the exact mechanism actively deciding the 40% premium you pay for the diesel that delivers the groceries to your local supermarket.
The political gridlock happening in the halls of Washington isn't just dry C-SPAN fodder. It is the direct reason you'll stand in line for 3 hours at an airport security checkpoint while an unpaid TSA agent struggles to pay rent.
International tariff disputes are not abstract trade theory. They are directly raising the price of basic biological necessities, forcing women to physically change how they manage their health. And artificial intelligence is no longer science fiction. It is simultaneously deciding the ethical boundaries of how wars are fought by the Pentagon, while quietly learning exactly what music to pump into your ears to keep you subscribed to an app. The web is entirely connected, and you are caught in the vibrations.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. It builds on the bizarre interception of these forces, specifically the collision of human biology and corporate economics.
Lay it on us.
Think about the staggering rise of the GLP-1 weight loss drug craze happening concurrently with an agonizing spike in the daily cost of living. We now have millions of people willingly paying thousands of dollars for pharmaceutical medication to chemically induce themselves to eat less food.
Right.
In response to this sudden drop in demand, the massive food conglomerates are shrinking the physical portion sizes of their snacks, adding a cheap dash of whey protein and aggressively charging more for them under the guise of premium GLP-1 friendly marketing. So we have an advanced society taking expensive injected medication to artificially lose their appetite, only to turn around and pay a premium inflated price for the privilege of eating smaller amounts of highly processed food. Are we actually utilizing medical breakthroughs to cure a biological health crisis, or did Wall Street simply figure out a brilliant, multifaceted way to successfully monetize the act of eating less?
That is a deeply unsettling question, and it's definitely one that will stick with you the next time you walk down the grocery aisle and see a shrunken pretzel marketed as a health food. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the underlying forces rapidly shaping 2026. Keep looking closely at the spiderweb and always keep questioning the mechanics of the systems operating around you. We'll catch you next time.